All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody around the world. Today is Thursday, April 26th, 2018. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture meeting, and hopefully you are in the right place for the right meeting. And I am your host, Jay Singer-Dumars, and co-host of the SIG currently is Brian Grant, and we'll kick off the meeting. The agenda is located at bit.ly/sig-architecture if you want to follow along after the fact and see the notes taken. We do need a note taker volunteer, so I am unfortunately not able to do it this time due to technical issues. So if anybody could take notes as we go, that would be tremendously appreciated.
Yeah, I can do that if you like.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind. Okay, so it looks like, so just digging into the overview of the agenda, it looks like we're going to talk charter and some leads and how that fits into the charter. So first off is the charter PR is up. There's a link to it in the agenda. I will paste it also in chat if that is helpful. Of course, copying it is not super easy. It's also in the SIG Architecture Slack channel. So if you want to go there and look at it, if somebody could paste it in there, that would be great. My Mac is being very persnickety this morning. So yeah, basically right now we don't have any comments on it. I made a note in this PR in the comments about there was a running discussion that wasn't resolved and was really about talking about company affiliation as a key determiner for membership in the lead positions. And so that it was basically largely resolved for the chairs, because the chairs are considered or should be considered not power positions in the sense of decision making. They're really administrative, trying to help coordinate resources and whatnot. So
yeah, they also don't require the same skill set or as much
yeah.
knowledge, especially historical knowledge of the project. So
right.
Aside from getting people to do work, in some ways those positions are easier to fill.
Yes, agreed. And so then the remaining discussion was around the technical leads and whether a majority of technical leads were required to be not of the same company. And with 3 technical leads, that means de facto that everybody has to be from a separate company. So that is where the discussion is. I would like to have a productive discussion around this. And interestingly, it looks like somebody added some things around candidates and chairs for tech leads. I'm not sure who did that, but we'll talk about that in a second as a sub part of this conversation. So
yeah, so if you look at the charter, either I recommend rendering the markdown. The raw markdown is not super readable.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. That's totally my fault.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Tables are not going to be readable in markdown anyway.
No.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So one quick thing though, with the chairs, they do not only do a certain amount of logistical, but they do wrangling during the meeting. And if one company has the ability to control how the meeting is wrangled, that can lead to certain kind of non-technical kind of controls over it. And so that is sometimes why chairs from multiple organizations is desired, just because of how they can direct the flow of a meeting.
Yep. So if you look at the language, that does say a majority of the chairs need to be from, can't be from the same company, which means they all have to be from different companies. Okay. So we did adopt that for the chairs.
Yeah. Okay. That question is really the technical lead position, because essentially what we're saying as the language is, or is suggested, the language in there right now is not the language that is. The language right now is language that says that two-thirds of the membership of the technical leads could be potentially from the same company. The rationale behind that is that the primary qualifier of the technical lead is depth of experience in the code base and ability to make extremely detailed technical decisions that have material impact on the entire life cycle of the project. So that's basically that. And Joe?
Yeah, so I worry, so there's a couple things that worry me about the proposed section right now. So the first one is how these people get decided and replaced. This set of technical leads has the potential, depending on how this comes out, to essentially be a de facto sort of like TOC for Kubernetes. This could very well be a pretty powerful set of folks in terms of making technical decisions that the avenues for appeal are going to be relatively limited. And so having it be a self-reinforcing set of group of people where they get to actually nominate their replacements doesn't seem the right way to actually deal with a group that has that much power and control. Again, it's going to be, there's the spirit of this stuff, and then there's sort of de facto, how does it play out over time? How much power and how much influence does this group have? And then with that in mind, having a small group of 3 also seems fairly limited. A huge amount of respect for the 3 folks that are named there, Clayton, Tim, and Brian. But the truth of the matter is that I think, Kubernetes is a bigger project than those 3 folks. And I don't think that they represent sort of the breadth of a lot of the projects that are ongoing and the things that are part of the ecosystem. So I think we need to make sure that we get a wider swath than just the, these super core components that are represented by these 3 folks.
Can I ask you a quick clarifying thing on that? Because Joe, you talked about the ecosystem and a lot of the projects that are going on. If I understand it right, SIG architecture deals with the architecture of core Kubernetes. And that means that the SIG technical lead wouldn't be able to say step into dashboard or something like Minikube and make architectural decisions on that because it's not part of the core. It's one of the other sub-projects. Is that right on the clarifying for scope of this?
I believe that's correct. I think also something about that is that we're not intending the technical leads to step into any SIG and tell them what to do necessarily. It's more of an arbitration role, and I would hope it doesn't get exercised too often. And practically speaking, regardless of how many people, it won't be able to be exercised very often just because they won't have the capacity to arbitrate every single technical decision in the project. Trust me, I've been there. It's just not humanly possible. And the SIG architecture itself has sub-projects, and those sub-projects are intended to be scoped to most of the ongoing issues. So hopefully those will shed additional load off the technical leads. Like if you look at the responsibilities, we tried to design it to be fairly limited, to keep it to things like creating new sub-projects in SIG architecture and dealing with escalations from areas of the project. And my other rationale for keeping it small was to just avoid like design by committee kinds of things. And we can potentially grow it in the future if we need to. I think it's unclear what in practice it's going to mean. I think, the people who come to SIG architecture so far for consulting and advice, I think we try to be respectful of all the opinions that are raised in SIG architecture, and so far have had pretty good discussions. API review is the most common case, and that specifically is going to be a sub-project, and we can deal with it, that specific issue and that sub-project. We already have a somewhat broader set of API approvers, which is 5. It's true that they're all from the same 2 companies because they're people who've been involved in the API design from the beginning, basically. So Joe.
Yeah, I think the other one more concern here is, Brian, you're obviously here, pretty much every meeting. Clayton's frequently in attendance. Tim, we haven't seen Tim here for a while. Clayton's not here right now. I don't feel like the other 2 members. Oh, what's that? You're here?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, you are SIG auth lead apparently.
Sorry.
Who is that? Is that Clayton?
Yeah, that's Clayton.
Yeah. Okay, that's Clayton. Yeah, and so okay, so yeah, Clayton's been a pretty regular attendee. Tim's a busy guy. I don't think he's been super involved in SIG architecture.
That is true. We are seeing what we can do to change that, but that is currently true.
And I mean, I would argue that Tim is kind of fulfilling that role of technical oversight for a number of SIGs today. I don't know if that's a feel like he's been
But that's
very.
a different role than this role, right? Because I think if we're going to scope this for just curating the set of sub-projects in the business and for SIG architecture, then it should probably be the set of folks who are, have been involved with SIG architecture over time. And Brian just got done saying that that's a very different job from technical oversight over.
That's true. But I mean, like in terms of, I was referring to it in terms of the curation of what is or isn't in terms of sub-projects. And again, like we're kind of like the arbitration part, I think, is the most important part, which is having a technical backstop for arbitration that can help close the loop. But I agree that there's a set of roles that are.
Well, should we make those distinct roles? Like I have architectural governance and API governance as two sub-projects. So it could be the roles depending on which kind of issue it is to be one of those two sub-projects. We could potentially combine those sub-projects into a single sub-project as well, but I was worried about the load level for that. I do want to, one other point I want to make is I think it's dangerous to create an official body that with official power that is significantly out of sync with kind of actual informal authority on the project. So I do want to try to avoid that if we can, and at least align it. And over time, we need to bootstrap more people into this group. That's one of the whole points of creating SIG architecture in the first place. But I think that is the reality right now.
So I also wonder, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sub-projects right now. There are 16 people on the call right now. Dan's probably not going to volunteer to actually sign up for a sub-project. Oh, and he's listed there twice. So we have 14 people on the call right now. I feel like we're cutting this in terms of the participation that we have right now in the SIG. We're cutting this pretty fine.
Yeah, we could definitely fold some of the sub-projects together. What I did to create that list is I took the initial set of responsibilities that were in the original charter and refined it and mapped. I did combine a couple of the responsibilities, but I did map them mostly one-to-one. I also split them by artifact, which it doesn't have to be. There are lots of sub-projects and other SIGs that combine multiple sets of artifacts together. Like API machinery has tons of stuff. So a lot of them, like all the client libraries, fold into one sub-project. So we can definitely do that. Deprecation policy maybe doesn't need to be a separate sub-project, for example.
So, I mean, so practically, what we've seen is folks have a gnarly technical issue or architectural issue that cuts across components in Kubernetes. They've come to this group to say, hey, how do I make forward progress to solve this problem? What's the best way forward? This group has rendered opinions. At some point, there may be hard decisions to be made there. That's sort of the primary function. I think most folks just looking at the titles will assume that it's the SIG tech leads are the ones who are actually empowered to make those types of decisions and give that type of advice. That is going to be the sort of de facto assumption for folks coming in. That's different from the set of responsibilities that you have listed here.
Should we change the name of the role?
SIG technical arbiter.
Well, but an arbiter that's the same thing, right? I mean, it's like people are like, hey, I need technical help on how to make progress with something in Kubernetes. I'm not sure how and where and how it lands, where to make forward. There's conflict. This is the group that deals with, the SIG in general is the group that deals with teasing that apart. I think it's useful for us to name the set of people who are empowered to do that. I'm not sure it's those three, and I'm not sure that that's the process for being able to do that.
Okay, hang on one sec. I think Matt's got a point, and then Quentin, you're not muted, so I'm assuming that you might have something to say as well. So
yes, after Matt.
Yeah. I just to add on to what Joe said, one of the things people are going to do is if, say, they're in the architectural governance or dealing with one of the sub-projects or somewhere else, and they don't like the answer they got, they're going to want to go to the arbitrators, the tech leads. And so that, while we can see that how and where they're from and who they represent matters in that, because if somebody's from one company and they say, I'm going to go to the arbitrators who are in my company and try and get, those things will happen. I've actually heard people say, no, I'm going to want to go do something like that. And so when we look at who they are and the responsibility that they have in writing, we should probably take into account what's going to happen when bad actors or people try to take advantage of that. So we make it so that it's in the best interest of the community, and we don't put too much pressure on somebody who works at one of those companies and is in that position to do something awkward either.
Okay, any responses to that before we go to Quentin? Okay, Quentin?
I was just going to point out that I would imagine a lot of this arbitration will actually happen in the sub-projects. So if someone comes to the SIG and says, I need, to understand how to like make my API work or whatever, they will go to that or be redirected to that sub-project to get some sort of opinion, arbitration, etc. And only if that breaks down, as I think we pointed out. So I would hope that escalation to the SIG leads is relatively infrequent, very infrequent.
Well, so first of all, you made the mistake of conflating SIG leads and the tech leads and all that, right? So that's one thing right there. And number two is that I think, yeah, the intent of this charter and of this process is to have these issues be dealt with by sub projects. I think practically folks are going to go directly to the tech leads of SIG architecture because of those are the people with the real power.
They will, but I think those people should redirect them to the sub-projects, I guess.
Well,
we haven't done a good job of that historically, honestly. I mean, like so much of the decision making in Kubernetes up until now has been person to person, talking to people out of band. We're trying to get better at redirecting people to actually go through sort of, wearing different hats, going through certain groups. But at the end of the day, in this particular SIG, there will be a set of people who have a certain amount of power, and people will assume that that's the SIG tech leads.
I mean, Tim or Joe, just to I kind of agree in one respect and I disagree in the other. So I agree in the respect that we're all wearing 17 hats, and it's getting really confusing just to switch hats day to day between that's something that we as mature adults in a community to have correct interpersonal relations have to do. I was kind of wondering, there's an immense amount of authority that approvers in projects are wielding today. So it's kind of interesting because you bring that up and I'm thinking people make massive changes for good reasons within SIGs today. It's not really you can change the arc of Kubernetes significantly within a SIG as an improver of a project, no matter what. And that's a good thing because that's delegating. You're mostly concerned, I think, about then people stop talking to their SIGs and then jump up to the top technical level because they see that. I agree that a lot of people are going to make that assumption, right? The technical lead is the person who makes technical decisions, which.
So, yeah. And I honestly think that there's a larger issue here, whereas you say that lots of people make sweeping changes and it happens within a SIG. And that does happen. But we also see a lot of times where people make sweeping changes. It cuts across SIGs. Yeah. They find the minimal set of users, often within the same company, that are approvers. And then they shove that through without necessarily getting the right visibility and oversight across things.
Is there a recent example of that? I maybe haven't seen that recently, but
nothing comes to mind within the past couple of months. This is a pattern that we've seen in the past, and it's something that I think part of us getting the SIGs more empowered is making sure that if changes cut across SIGs, even if there are some of the same people involved, we get the right level of visibility.
I'm going to push back on this notion, Joe. I just don't see this happening. We make such a huge effort to do all the discussion in the appropriate SIGs that I just don't agree with this perception at all, and I think it's dangerous to promote it when it's not actually accurate.
Okay, so where is there an API document covering the new JOT stuff that Mike has done, right? It's that stuff was, I had to call an audible on that saying we should have a document that should go through API review. I don't know if it has gone through API review. My guess is that he reached out to, Tim or somebody at Google who was on the API review or got a rubber stamp there.
Actually, my guess is it was probably Jordan.
It's Jordan and me, Jordan in the SIG auth hat, me in an API reviewer hat. I mean, and Joe, this is actually a good point because that's a working group that has representatives from a bunch of SIGs in it, including the owning SIGs and the people we're reviewing who are backstops on that. So I mean, it's a good example. It definitely needs
I don't think it was, there's no maliciousness there. I think there's just an issue of like, as we introduce, new APIs like that, I still don't feel like, I mean, that's a changing the trajectory of the project to some degree. We're adding more and more auth stuff. Kubernetes is becoming more and more of a sort of ground truth auth provider in a bunch of places. That's an architectural decision that wasn't run by this group. It was run by a set of people who wear hats across SIGs that gave approval to that.
So I definitely, I see that more of a, so I guess I agree about the communication aspect. I don't think it was a company related thing. I think it's
okay, maybe that's unfair there. Yeah.
Happening in the SIGs. That's what we were trying to resolve with KEP, but most people still don't understand it and they feel that it's too heavyweight and not going to work. Right. So, I agree about we need to write these things down instead of just discussing them in SIGs. I totally agree with that.
So Quentin has had his mic unmuted for a while. Quentin, was there something that you wanted to add?
Can someone stop presenting so I can see more of the people?
I think you can do both, but I can certainly stop.
I haven't been able to figure out how to do both. Like I clicked on everything that looks like.
I have two screens, admittedly. So I have the people on one screen and the presentation on the other, but that's fine. I stopped presenting. I didn't have anything concrete to add really, other than the fact that, I mean, we do have, if we don't like the way a given SIG is operating, if we, just to take this example, if we think SIG auth is kind of doing crazy stuff, I think we do have the ability to parachute someone in there. And I mean, for the most part, we have the key SIGs represented on this SIG. And if we do think that they are doing things that are overstretching their boundaries or doing something that this group doesn't think is a good idea, we have pretty clear mechanisms for addressing that. And they don't have to involve like adding a lot more process. They involve, telling Clayton we don't think SIG auth is, or Jordan, whoever is kind of involved there, that we would like them to do things differently, or parachuting people in there to, influence those discussions, I think. So I'm not sure that we have a real problem there.
And this is actually interesting because it's like everybody you mentioned, including all the leadership of SIG auth, enough of the representation from other SIGs, and a bunch of people in the community were involved in those kinds of things. And like, I think that is a good example of like, I would say that all the stakeholders were there. The sign-off perspective is kind of what's interesting, because it's like there's like, all the people that we would normally delegate to make that decision made a set of decisions. But what causes the concern, and to Joe's point, is feeling like SIG architecture should get to say that, and the KEP process is the way to do that. But like, I would kind of like, resource management grew scope of Kubernetes, and we didn't officially go through a review on it, but like there's a ton of work there. And it's basically, we've delegated the responsibility to grow resource management to the working group, and they've done that more or less, right? The device plugins and NVIDIA drivers and, all those things. It's like, I think there's an interaction of like SIG architecture as a veto group. And it sounds like we just weak on that process of like, and the KEP is the big part of that. And that's like a good example of like all the technical stakeholders felt that it was the right thing to do in the various SIGs, but then we had like the oversight body wanted to slow it down.
So wait, just for a moment of procedure here. Joe had his hand up, and before Joe had his hand up, Matt had his hand up, but I don't know if Joe's comment is related to this conversation or if Matt's was separate. So Matt, since you had the floor there first, can you just...
I was just going to give an example of one of the times where an org had a private roadmap and they were subtly pushing it through, but we can find examples of it if we go looking. I went digging and it was inside of kube control. But that's all I was going to do. We're past that.
Okay,
I won't get into the details.
I'll just make a pitch for more people in SIG CLI while I'm at it. So like, we're really having trouble getting to work on that. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I think, my concern is not that I don't think any SIGs are off the rails. I don't think anybody's doing anything malicious. I think that, my biggest concern is, again, I don't think we necessarily contain things through SIGs. We don't think about work streams for SIGs because there's a lot of overlap of people between SIGs. If somebody's in SIG auth and they happen to be an API reviewer, boom, they can do whatever, right? And I think we need to think about how do we actually deal with groups of people instead of individual people as we deal with stuff that has larger impact on the project.
Okay, that's a good point. I actually want to raise something that Joe, you emailed me about, which I actually agree with, which is that I think there was not a KEP, but a proposal that was written for this SIG auth feature, but then it didn't get merged for months, and the work was all implemented. So, I mean, that is one of the kinds of patterns that I do see a lot, where either people don't go through the proposal process, or they do, but they don't actually attempt really to push it through to closure. And that is something whether it's KEP or something else, I would like to try to solve that so that there's more clarity about what we're actually doing and whether agreement has been reached and whether it's done and things like that.
Yeah, one thing I would like to see is kind of a roadmap for a feature, like, because what we have frequently is there's an agreed on goal, and then there's an agreed on first set of steps, and then there are other issues that need to be worked through, but the first set is agreed on, and trying to figure out how to describe that and represent that and say, yes, we agree on steps A, B, and C. Let's go start working on that, and then hammer out like the next set. And right now it's unclear. Like what I see are design docs that get merged with kind of future work sections, and it's unclear, like, is this agreed? Is this not agreed? Or they just sit in pending and it's not merged. And so it's unclear what we're supposed to do there.
Or everybody's basically like, yep, we like this. And there's somebody in a SIG or a group of people are like, okay, I'm going to go prototype this out and get working on it. And it's kind of like the process rigmarole, and I use rigmarole in a loving sense there. The people get the idea, they get agreement, and there's maybe not enough social pressure or like cultural pressure in the org to say, okay, let's merge the first part and make it clear. And I think the KEP process has done a lot to improve that. Like that has a lot of that.
We got to finish it.
We got to finish it. And that's the thing is like, the proposal, like as Joe's, like we have a ton of proposals that most of the discussion takes place in the first week or two or month. And then prototyping starts, and there'll be like a comment on the proposal, which is like, can you change this one word?
Or there's like 2 sticky points that just sit there for months that no one has really good answers to. And yeah, it's unclear. Should this merge? Should we rip out those pieces and merge the rest? What should we do?
It's process over, like it's kind of the driving it to a concrete conclusion. And what do we do to create more incentives to actually anchor that so that it shows up so that, others can participate. And that's it.
So Quinn had his hand up and Joe had his hand up, but I want to, I think we're way off topic, and I kind of want to close down this discussion and say we should follow up on the charter. This is take this as an open item. Please make suggestions about the name and responsibility and other aspects of this role. And I will take a look at collapsing sub-projects. Quentin.
Yeah, I just had a sort of zooming out of the details that we've been dealing with recently. I just had a question for the group. So it seems like we could err on the side of, becoming the Wild West, and people are making like terrible changes all over Kubernetes, and we don't have controls and processes in place to sort of prevent that from happening. And on the other extreme, we could have tons and tons of controls and processes, and we could end up with a situation where we think the project is not moving forward fast enough and effective enough. And I would like to kind of canvass whether our collective opinion is that which of those two sides are we erring towards? Are we kind of making a lot of bad changes that are like out of control, or are we not making forward progress fast enough? My perspective, my sense is that we're on the latter of those. We're bogged down in quite a bit of process and not making enough progress. Sure, we're making some mistakes along the way, and sure, we could have had some more complete KEPs and things, but I think we're erring too much on the slowing down side. But I'd be interested what the rest of the group feels about that.
Joe.
So first thing that I remembered what really bothered me about the mic thing is that it was a SIG auth API thing, and then I turn around and all of a sudden we're creating new volume types. Right. So we expanded its scope, and it was like none of that stuff was brought back to the working group or SIG auth that I saw. I might have missed some meetings and such, but it was all of a sudden, boom, it brought in a whole new set of things. The second thing is with respect to the charter, just trying to solve that issue. I would be supportive of having, out of SIG architecture, coming up with some sort of technical advisory board that collapses some of those sub projects and the idea of the tech leads, recognizing that there's just going to be a ton of overlap of responsibilities and it's going to become a mishmash anyways. So that's something that I'd like folks to consider. And then with respect to Quentin's issue around sort of, are we moving too fast or are we moving too slow? I think that the project is in dire danger of having lots of features that are not coherent and not documented and collapsing under its own weight. And so I think right now, in terms of the number of features we have, new features should take a backseat to actually making the project usable and coherent, for a wider set of users. I think going deeper with our current users is not the right way to go. We need to go wider, and that requires a different mindset. So that's my opinion.
So having been in a place where before people were accusing me of slowing down the project from reviewing everything, I mean, that's definitely the trade-off. You get more consistency and cohesion if you review with a smaller number of people, just by nature of the way that works. But indeed, it slows things down. If you actually look at the GitHub stats, they are slowing down pretty significantly. And I think the reason is mostly not process. Although maybe depending on how you argue it, maybe you could call it process, but it's things like technical debt and inability to grow the set of reviewers and approvers and route issues to the right people. When the project was smaller, it was actually easier to fan out things to a larger number of people because it was more obvious who those people were and there are fewer sources of changes. And now the volume is just so high that it's we've not been able to get grips on the routing tasks. There are some positive reasons why changes in Kubernetes have slowed down too, which is we've successfully moved some of those changes outside of the core. But I think we need to do a much better job at addressing the technical debt and at fanning out the set of changes to the appropriate people. Not random people, because that ends up being noise, and communicating to the rest of the project about the technical direction that we actually want to go. I've been realizing recently that that's not super well communicated. So we need to find, we don't actually have like a community tech talks or interviews or things like that. We've been talking about doing API reviews in this meeting, but it doesn't have broad enough attendance to be effective at communicating to the rest of the project how we think things should be working and the direction we're actually going.
That's something I'm going to be hopefully working on. I think that we need to do that, not only for this group, but also the steering committee and probably a lot of other groups as well. It's just too hard to consume the information as is.
Yeah, so one thing I could do as a specific action is I did write a document about the resource model, and that did get in. It knocked quite a number of things off my design doc backlog of things that were principles that we've been applying for a long time but were undocumented. I could convert that to a talk and present it, for example.
So when we first did the community meeting on Thursdays, when I first created that, I think my goal there was to do some of those, broad architectural decisions, APIs. Now it's morphed into being a more outward facing, let's do a demo and a report type of thing. But I feel like that meeting is kind of drifting a little bit, and it might be worthwhile trying to retarget it to be more contributor inward facing versus hey, here's a cool demo.
Okay, we should probably discuss that in contributor experience. But yeah, I mean, definitely when there were like 20 people on the project, a lot of the technical discussion and work happened in that meeting because it was pre-SIG. Right now, a lot of that discussion happens in the SIGs.
There's something, just quickly to go back to the charter for a minute and the PR. There's a very important proviso in there that basically there's a forced refresh on this in 6 months. So if people are worried about this being the law of the land and staying that way forever, there's an implicit review ratification of the charter in 6 months after the date after it's merged. So that is something just to keep in mind, that we're not going to live with whatever these decisions are forever by nature of the document itself.
We should probably add a change process to the doc.
Yeah, that is actually a really good idea.
Okay, so anyway, please do read the charter PR. We'll try to get some feedback. Next week, meeting is canceled, so I guess we can revisit it in 2 weeks. But if you do have time in between traveling and whatnot, please do try to take a look. Matt had the last item on the agenda.
Oh, I did?
External tools, controllers, updating spec versus controller.
Okay, yeah.
I
I forgot about it. I had to think about it for a minute. So the item was, we were discussing the application CRD and controller. And one of the things that was in there was, there's a field on the spec that kind of says the status. Is the thing that you're doing being installing? Is it installed? Is it updating and whatnot? And the question came up of, shouldn't that be on a status object instead? And the response was, well, it's external tools that are updating this. Things like kube control stuff from the CLI, not a controller running inside Kubernetes technically, or typically. It'll typically be something outside, like a CLI that's interacting with the API, and an ecosystem tool. And those shouldn't update status. At the same time, a controller running inside should only update status, not the spec. And so the question became, is what can update stuff? Should a CLI running externally be able to update status if it kind of makes technical sense? Should a controller be able to update spec? Like, where does this come from? And so there was this kind of unofficial idea of controllers only update status, nothing else, and external tools only update spec, never status. And if there are fields that may make sense on the other objects, you have to kind of replicate them to the right place or do it there instead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, interestingly, Wojtek brought up a similar issue. What should be spec and what should be status? And this actually is covered to some degree in the API conventions, but this exact way of slicing it is not. So that would be a good thing for me to add to my design doc backlog, I guess. So there are a few considerations. One is we do have cases where controllers update the spec of their own resources, cluster IP being the canonical example. And people have pushed back on that and said, well, this is status, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, Joe's doing the thumbs down. But the reality is status is intended to be the spec is intended to be the full desired state, including things that are set by automation. And the cluster IP is an example where it's dynamically allocated. It can't be re-derived from observation from any other source. So that is the reason that it's in spec. The user can specify it actually if they want to choose their own IP, and that will get reserved for them. Otherwise, it's left to that to be allocated automatically as a convenience for the user. But if that information were lost, there is no way to actually rederive that information. So that is one of the considerations about spec or status. The status information should be reconstructible from observation of other resources or external sources. If the controller is controlling some external entity like a container or something like that.
So the node that a pod gets bound to, real quick, Brian. So the node that a pod gets bound to, is that status or is that spec?
That's spec.
It's just who is the spec targeted to is the trick, right?
The spec is the full elaborated desired state, including things set by automation. The user can also set their own node name. So that is legitimate. Or if they write their own scheduler or something like that, they can set the node name.
They want to implement a batch scheduler or.
Yeah, so that's the principle there. So controller-wise, I actually agree that status should be set by a controller because it's intended to reflect the current status. If something changed in the spec and nothing is acting on that change, then the status won't accurately reflect the spec. So I haven't seen a specific example. I didn't quite grok the whole application CRD scenario, but I would be hesitant to put things that are set by like a manually triggered process in the status. I think there will be clients that set a number of fields, like leader election was one case we were discussing. Currently, that's all in one lump in an annotation. So there is a question of, if that were a CRD, would any of those fields be in status? I need to go back and look at some of those fields, but I believe all the fields would be set by the client and none of them by a controller. So it wasn't obvious to me that any should be in status.
So here, I just dropped in the link to the application. And if you scroll down, there's a table. And the bottom item in the table is assembly phase. Pending, succeeded, or failed. And this is on the spec. And it's got a description next to it. This might help with the specific case that we're looking at.
I mean, an interesting thing, and this I think gets to Joe's, is like I might have a little bit less rigid a definition than Brian does, which is spec is what the actor cares about, the user specifying, and status is what the system tells them back, regardless of what part of the system it is. Like, I think there's a couple different definitions, but I don't say that my application is running. The application is observed to be running, and I'm told that. That's how I tend to break those down, because I think there's a lot of cases where a status-like thing is useful, where it's not specifically an observable from the cluster itself status, like it's from another source of truth, whether it's another resource or a different outside the cluster.
Another source of truth is fine.
Yeah, it's whether it can be rederived. You could have multiple things participating in setting different parts of the status.
So pod IP is status. Yeah, that can be figured out from the underlying container. And also, if you lose that container, you get a new pod IP, which surprises some people, but it does happen.
Okay. So I'm guessing you would call this thing status because it could be rederived, I think. We'll have to check. We'll have a good discussion on it. But I think you've given us enough to
anything that has a selector is almost implicitly saying that the state of the selector is rederived. Like, you're saying, observe these things. These are all appropriate. Whoever is looking at those things is the one who knows whether they're all in a good state or not the person who provided the selector.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've got I think you've given us enough now to have a healthy conversation on it. Oh.
Joe?
So one other thing that you might want to take a look at and maybe take some hints from, and I'd love to get Brian Clayton's take on this, is the whole discussion around conditions versus events. If you have multiple actors that want to sort of annotate the status, using the condition pattern where they can add to that array, maybe having an owner on that condition so that you actually understand which component is writing what part of the status in an extensible way. I'm not sure if that applies here or not, but that might be something that's worth thinking about.
So we actually, in the node objects, have at least 3 entities that are writing conditions: the kubelet, the node controller, and the node problem detector. There, in many cases, there are multiple components that can actually write those fields, and we're actually thinking of modeling it as sort of who has the lock kind of thing. So that's one thing we're exploring right now, but some of them would be only written by the node problem detector, so it would effectively own those fields. I think in many cases that's a useful pattern just for node reporting specifically. There have been a number of cases where we needed both internal and external observers. I suppose we could split those to separate conditions, but we didn't do that for whatever reason.
Also, anytime you draw a line between internal and external, assuming that there's only 2 partitions, is like you're going to end up with internal, external, and more external, and even more external, and so collapsing them all into a single mechanism.
Yeah, automation is a really slippery slope.
Yeah.
As well. Like, should the replicas field be in status? Or CPU and memory? Should those, if it's set by an autoscaler or something like that? Like I don't actually think that makes sense. If you look at all the different kinds of automation that we're adding in emission controllers and other automated components, I think the model is much cleaner if you just say, anything. It might be manual, it might be automatic, can set properties, is a much more sound model.
And I think it's worth noting that like every point of difference causes confusion. And so like any case where you have multiple writers, it's usually an exceptional case. So you kind of want single writer, single reader, single spec, single status, and where it's different, try to keep it low until you can split it out. Like people can't, like even service IP causes problems because people want to reuse services across clusters. Node name causes problems because most of the time a human doesn't set it, but when they do, like, you might have different actors. Anytime you have multiple actors, it's going to be confusing. So like the good rule of thumb is 90% of the time you should have one actor for an object, and the exception should be exceptional.
I would have modeled something like the node being sort of like, desired node and then sort of assigned node, and actually have a phase there. Same thing with the cluster IP. Even if both of those things end up being part of the spec, being able to have clarity for this is the actor intended to write this particular field, I think helps to get clarity. And so a lot of this, the BS that we're sort of, dealing with around apply is because we have this confusion over sort of which actor is actually writing which field in which situation, and that information gets lost along the way.
Yeah, we're running into very similar problems with federation actually, where, and we ended up splitting these things into multiple objects just so that it was clear that this is what the user asked for and this is what some controller, allocated them. And they're actually separate objects and they have single writer each, and everything gets much simpler.
All right, so we're getting
the right solution, but yeah.
Off topic again. If we, people who are interested in that particular topic, Daniel produced a bunch of great docs and presentations that explain this in much more complete detail than has ever been written down before. Dozens of pages. So.
Well, I mean, just to be clear, so Daniel's proposal is both documenting sort of where we are now, but also, where he wants to take it. I'm not sure that helps Matt today.
There are one of his documents, I don't have the link handy right now, but one of his documents spells out dozens and dozens of specific scenarios and use cases and patterns. Okay. So independent of the implementation mechanism, so that people can actually understand the problem space better.
What is that thing called? How do we find that thing?
Clayton said he would try to find it.
Is that the apply presentation you're talking about, or a different one?
There's a different one. I'll try to dig it up.
This is another example, I think, where, getting this documentation in the right places, making sure the proposals actually, we know what the status is, we know where it is. There's just, there's a lot of great content out there. There's a lot of great thinking. It's just not communicated in a way where folks,
Well, the apply presentation was given to like 4 SIGs.
Oh, it was, but then there's the question of like, okay, you give a presentation, what now, right? Is it a link that gets lost in the mailing list somewhere? What is the current status of that plan? These are the things that I think, it's not a point in time thing. It's a over longitudinal.
Yeah, and we need to get all that stuff documented. There are a bunch of tables and other things that were a little bit hard and maybe didn't really fit in a KEP proper, but I think he was planning to write a KEP with kind of the core bits and link out to other materials. And the markdown conversion stuff seems to be working reasonably, so we'll probably use that approach to get these other artifacts, not the presentations probably, but the other documents converted to markdown.
And there's a working group for apply. I didn't see this.
Well, that's a whole nother, that was part of my email about work group.
Okay, I missed that one altogether. Just snuck through.
Okay. I do have one final question though. Hopefully final. The whole issue, back to the technical leads and companies and that stuff that we started off with, we kind of got off track from it, but that was the big point that from the original doc and even from our meeting didn't appear to be resolved. I'm not asking for it to be resolved now, but I don't get the impression it is resolved. And so how do we go from here with that?
I put a to-do on that in the charter, and the to-do is basically to reevaluate the roles, responsibilities, and the name and the structure and things like that. So I also made a note to go fold some of the sub-projects together and make those responsibilities and authority more clear. So I think those are the two big action items, like which things fall under API review or architectural review sub-project versus what things roll up to what was called the technical leads. But I agree a better name is probably appropriate given what we expect the responsibilities of that role to be. So if people have suggestions, please put them there. Like I hear Joe mentioned some kind of advisory board or something. Not 100% sure that fits, but that would be one thing. Like you could actually sketch that out. Advisory board, here are the responsibilities, and then people can evaluate whether it fits. So if we have a couple of alternative suggestions, you can see if any of those really resonate with people. I think that
So
would be.
how do you want that, Brian? Should I put that in a comment in the PR?
Yeah,
or?
that would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, and then like said earlier, 2 weeks we'll revisit that. So if anybody has any spare time, you're sitting around in your hotel room after a busy day of KubeCon, take a look and add stuff because that'll help.
Yeah, so thanks to everyone who helped flesh out the charter, Jace, Quentin, Matt. It was a slog, it was like several hours of like copying in the template and going through and chasing down the sub-projects and refining the wording and working out details about, this procedure doesn't actually say how it should work at all and things like that. There are actually some things we need to go back and fix in the template because they're pretty confusing or underspecified. But I think at least now there's a good like initial straw man that people can make more targeted suggestions about improvements for. I forgot the one thing about the change process. I can go comment on that right now. But yeah, if there are other like glaring things that are missing or things like that, that would be helpful to just like draft a little section as a proposal, at least as a straw man starting point would be super useful.
I want to add one thing real quick. This is just an aside, is that earlier in our meeting in the first half, while we're having this discussion, there was a new contributor who was on this call and sent me a private message saying, wow, I finally know what a respectful discussion around contentious topics looks like. So that's a big kudos to everybody in this meeting. Thank you.
And I do want to say thank you for Jason, Brian, for slogging through the charter stuff. I think, being able to step back and look at it as a whole really puts it in perspective. And I think, I apologize for not seeing the total shape until you guys, put that stuff together. But thanks for doing that.
Well, the shape was definitely hard to see when it was fragments and separate templates and comments and whatever. So no worries.
All right, anything else before you wrap up here? All right, everybody, thank you so much. And I'm truly looking forward to seeing you all next week, hopefully. So take care, everybody. Have a great day.